Good morning here from London, and I'm delighted to have today a dear friend of mine, Michael Powers, who, and this is the great element, if there are some great elements about the pandemic, who's dialing in from Beijing, from Tsinghua University. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
Meet you. Now, today's topic sounds extraordinary because it is. It says assessing extraordinary claims, actuarial science, and the search for truth. Now, this is an opportunity for me to tell all of my actuarial jokes, which I shan't do, because I do think that we frequently overlook actuarial science and its deep effects on our understanding of knowledge itself, as well as areas such as insurance and pensions. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors of Zien, and I am not the star today, Michael Powers is, but I can only handle so many of these webinars due to the tolerance, if I can call it that, of our sponsors, who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And I find it interesting that we are holding today's event just after I spent a lunchtime last Thursday listening to extraordinary claims about longevity from somebody who is deep into the topic. And so today I think you'll find most interesting. Meanwhile, anyway, my job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from our experts. So three very quick points, if I may. Firstly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up in approximately 2 working days, so perhaps midday on Thursday, London time. Secondly, yes, the slides are here and they're being posted, and they will be posted on the website. But most importantly, please do feed in questions, comments, and answers, because today is a topic that I think all of us are interested in. How long will we live? And I'm sure that you've got a lot to contribute. So questions, comments, and observations. But don't text them to me, don't signal me, don't WhatsApp me, don't Insta me, whatever, don't email me. I'm here with you. So please do use the GoTo webinar question facility, and all of your questions, comments, and observations will be sent to Michael with email attached. If you want to pick up on a point of detail or anything, just type it in there and we'll make sure that he gets it. Anyway, enough from me. Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this series. The title of my talk is Assessing Extraordinary Claims. And so in a minute, I will begin by talking about what exactly I mean by an extraordinary claim, which will also involve what I mean by an extraordinary event. And then the subtitle is Actuarial Science and the Search for Truth. The reason I have this reference to actuarial science is that I intend to borrow 2 things from that subject area. One is the problem, the specific problem that I want to focus on to study the idea of an extraordinary claim. And the other one is that in the context of considering extraordinary claims, we'll talk about the use of subjective information or judgment. And I want to borrow a tool that professional actuaries use to incorporate subjective information with more objective, so to speak, experimental or observational data. Next slide. I'd like to begin with something, the so-called Sagan Standard. Now, this is a dictum that was popularized by Carl Sagan, the American astronomer. He first used it in his television program Cosmos in 1980, which to me seems like just yesterday, but I know it's quite a number of years ago. And the statement is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This has become a standard dictum in many contexts, and I think that is generally accepted by most people. In fairness, Sagan was not the person who first said this. That honor, or at least as far as I can find on the internet, goes to Philip Abelson, an American physicist who said exactly the same thing a couple of years earlier. Marcello Truzzi said something very similar a couple of years earlier. So obviously this idea was in the air around the time that Sagan put it on his program, but he certainly popularized it, and so it's now known as the Sagan Standard. I think that just to be brief about it, the idea is that if you're going to try to convince me of something unusual or extreme, something very much out of the ordinary. You had better come to me with substantial evidence. You better have done some, serious work, come up with some unusual evidence to convince me that this extraordinary claim is valid. The rest of the slide has some earlier quotes on which I'll let you read at your leisure. Next slide. I just want to point out very briefly, in the interest of parsimony, that the Sagan Standard is related to Occam's Razor, but it's not exactly the same thing. Occam's Razor, and by the way, I have a number of different versions of that, is really a call for parsimony or economy in terms of explaining phenomena in science. And actually, the statements by Aristotle and Isaac Newton, I think, are probably better, clearer than the one by William of Occam himself. But the idea is that if you go beyond the simplest explanation, which might be the case with an extraordinary claim, then you really have to present, you have to make an exception in a sense to Occam's Razor. And that would be the extraordinary evidence that's talked about in the Sagan Standard. Next slide, please. I will need to define what an extraordinary claim and an extraordinary event are. I'm going to do this in a very coarse way. I will say that an extraordinary claim is an assertion that an extraordinary event either has occurred or will occur sometime in the future. What is an extraordinary event? Well, that requires a little bit more detail. I have a two-part definition. It's a rough definition. The first part is that it has to be very, very unlikely in an a priori sense. It has to have a very low probability. I'm going to use a threshold of 1 out of a million. I didn't choose that number myself. That comes from the English mathematician Littlewood, his so-called law of miracles, in which he attempted to estimate how often a person sees a true miracle, and he used 1 out of a million as the threshold for that kind of event. By the way, he said we see them about 1 every 30 days, but I'm not going to go any further into that law of miracles today. I just want to use the threshold. He also is not so clear about this, and to be honest, he doesn't have it written down. Littlewood does not have this recorded. It's recorded through the American scientist Freeman Dyson, who wrote about it some years after he heard it from Littlewood. And there's a second part, but it isn't so clear in Dyson's summary, and that is that the event not only has to have a very low probability, but it has to be in some way conspicuous. It has to be significant or have some importance. And what I want to point out is the way that usually happens is through prediction. And the prediction could be a matter of prophecy. So our friend Nostradamus perhaps makes a prediction of some event that is very unlikely to occur. We say that's an extraordinary claim. Or perhaps more recently, Albert Einstein might predict something according to his general theory of relativity. For example, light is bent by gravitation. That becomes an alternative hypothesis in the scientific method. It's an extraordinary claim because it was not part of the status quo. Now it has to be supported by some extraordinary event. That is some evidence, experimental evidence, that would be considered unusual prior to having this hypothesis. Next slide, please. To make it very concrete, imagine I take a fair coin out of my pocket that has equal probability of giving me heads or tails. I toss the coin 20 times, I get heads, tails, 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 heads, tails, and so forth. That sequence of 20 coin tosses has an a priori probability of less than 1 out of a million. Any sequence of 20 would have a probability of less than 1 out of a million, but there's nothing extraordinary about it, nothing conspicuous about it, and therefore we wouldn't say that it's an extraordinary event. However, if I pull the coin out and I said, I'm going to toss heads, tails, 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 heads, tails, and so forth, and then I went ahead and did it. Well, first of all, my statement would be an extraordinary claim, and then the actual realization would be an extraordinary event. So that's what I mean practically by an extraordinary claim and an extraordinary event. Next slide. Okay, we're going to shift gears here and turn to the world of actuarial science, because I want to come up with a concrete problem, interesting problem to work with. The slide is titled rather presumptuously, "The Most Important Open Question." If we have any actuaries in the audience, they may disagree with this. My choice is, what is the maximum possible human lifespan? Why? Because we're all human beings. We want to know how long we're going to live. That seems to be something that's on everybody's mind at some point in their life. And it's, even though I don't work in the area of life insurance, I work more in property liability type issues. I think that this is the most important, intellectually the most important question. Well, how are we going to model that? Think of an individual born, they're born at time zero, they live their life, they die at some random time. That time from birth till death we can think of as a random variable. It has a probability distribution. Do we model it as a number from 0 to infinity, or as a number from 0 to some finite upper bound omega? There really is no confirmed answer to this question. People could have different theories that would lead to different alternatives. We might believe, for example, that omega today is finite, but someday it will be infinite. For my talk, I'm going to assume that omega is finite, and I'm going to assume that it's more or less the same omega for every human being everywhere in the world. And I will acknowledge that probably that's not the case, and it also probably changes over time. But I want to have a simplifying assumption that omega is a constant and applies to everybody. And we want to try to estimate it. Next slide. How are we going to estimate omega? Well, there are many different ways. And if there are professional actuaries who work in life insurance or annuities, I'm sure they can think of better ways than the one that I'm going to talk about. But the one that I'm going to suggest, I think, is intuitive. It's fairly straightforward. We have available data on the longest lifespans of people that have been verified. There's a group called the Gerontology Research Group, who has a list of people who have lived to 110 or more. Those people are called super centenarians. And the database has about 1,700 or more individuals in it. I don't have all 1,700 ages, but I do have the top 101, the 101 longest lifespans, because they're available on Wikipedia. And so I took them down and I did some work with them. These people were born in the window of time from 1870 to 1907. Clearly, medical standards were different. We wouldn't say that a person born then would have the same life expectancy of a person born now. But for simplicity, let's assume that all of those people born between 1870 and 1907 had the same distribution of time to live. Their lifespan was the same kind of random variable. It had the same upper bound omega. And we'll say that our 101 longest lifespans are just the longest or the largest values in the sample of all the people that were born then. I don't know how many people were born during that period, but I have a very crude estimate that it's somewhere around 300 million births. So we'll say that we're looking at the top 101 ages from a sample of about 300 million. Those two ladies at the bottom of the slide are the record holders at the moment. And let's turn to the next slide. To give you a flavor, these are the top 10 recorded human lifespans. One thing to note is that two of these individuals are still alive. Another thing is I believe they're all female. And a third thing is that the record holder, Jeanne Calment of France, she reached the age of 122 years, 164 days, and that right now is the maximum observed human lifespan. But there's one further thing to note about that, and that is that if you look at the gap between her age at death and the age of Sarah Knauss from the United States, who is second on the table, it's actually a gap of more than 3 years. And if you look down the list of ages, that gap, the gaps are much smaller. The gap between Calment and Knauss is really quite large compared to the other ones. And so there's a question there about what is it that explains this gap? Next slide, please. So is Jeanne Calment's lifespan of 122 plus years an extraordinary event? Is the claim of that an extraordinary claim? Certainly it's remarkable that someone would live that long, but since we're looking at data on the very longest human lifespans recorded, we would expect the numbers to be quite large, in the neighborhood of 120 or so. And so even though the probability of a baby at birth living to that age is much, much less than 1 out of a million, this is really not extraordinary, because conditioning on looking at the very longest lived people, it perhaps is not so unlikely. But what is unlikely is that it's a statistical outlier. As I noted, there's a gap between the age of death of Jeanne Calment and the age of death of Sarah Knauss. And if you look at the slide, the plot on the left, you can see the actual values of the lifespans. They're all in excess of 114 years, which is the lowest number on the y-axis. And then in the upper right, is the age of Jeanne Calment, which is circled in blue. It looks like an outlier. If you wanted to do a formal test, an easy way to do that, go to the slide on the right. I took ratios of the successive lifespans. So the point in the upper right on the right is the ratio of Jeanne Calment's age to Sarah Knauss's age. And as you can see, that ratio is clearly far away from the average or median of these ratios, which are all very close to 1. And this one is very significantly farther away. Next slide, please. Because of this large gap, this outlier, and also because if we look on the slide, the second point here in blue, a quote from Norris McWhorter, who with his brother Ross were the founders of the Guinness Book of World Records. No single subject is more obscured by vanity, deceit, falsehood, and deliberate fraud than the extremes of human longevity. Now, I'm sure you can think of some other things that people may want to boast about that also may be obscured by vanity, deceit, and falsehood. But certainly age and longevity is one of them. And the next point is kind of interesting. And that is that from US Social Security data, people did a study some years ago and found that of deaths between 1980 and 2009, of people that were supposed to be super centenarians, that is 110 or older, when they took a look at those people who died in that period with an recorded age of 110 or more, and they looked more closely, they found that 80% of them involved an error, either an intentional misrepresentation or some sort of accident. So there has been an accusation that the Calment claim is fraudulent. This came up some years ago, and it was repeated and somewhat popularized by a couple Russian scientists in 2018, Novoselov and Zach. And they essentially argued that and made a case that the real Jeanne Calment passed away in 1934, and then she was replaced by her daughter Yvonnie, who was born in 1898, and then it was Yvonnie who passed away in 1997, and she was only 99 years old at that time. Next slide, please. There's a considerable amount of evidence on both sides of this issue, and a number of papers have been published. I have some of the references here. I have a list of bullet points that go over some of the more salient sources of evidence. Essentially, the argument that Zach makes is that there was a strong financial motive for Yvonne to take the place of Jeanne Calment. And I'm not going to go into how plausible that is. I'm not going to go into most of these other items. One of the bullet points is on photographic evidence. I'm going to show you some photos later, and you can decide for yourself what you think in terms of this case. I do want to mention also the last two things because I think that they're somewhat relevant. They're floating around in the background. Jeanne Calment is a celebrity in France. I am not French, but I did a little due diligence. My dentist here in Beijing is French, and he's been in Beijing for 14 years. But I asked him if he knew who Jeanne Calment was, and he said, oh, certainly we all know who Jeanne Calment is. So at least people, I guess, his age, which is similar to my age, would know who Jeanne Calment is in France. And the other thing I want to point out is that she does have some tissue samples, some blood samples available. A DNA test could determine whether the woman who passed away was the mother or the daughter without exhuming any bodies. But somewhat strangely, a DNA test has not been conducted. Next slide, please. So the scientific consensus is in the gerontological community. The actuarial community, as far as I know, hasn't said too much about this particular issue. But the gerontologists, the professional gerontologists, are pretty much lined up behind the validity of the Calment claim. They believe that it's correct. In fact, some of them are very upset with Zach's accusations. There's a paper by Robin and Allard. They explicitly call for retraction of Zach's article. I should note that Robin and Allard were members of a team that actually investigated and verified Jeanne Calment's claim when it first was made after she passed away. There's another paper that's very interesting by Young, and he worked for the Guinness World Records Association, and he says actually that there is no evidence against the claim, which I find a little difficult to believe because although some of Zach's arguments may be a bit far-fetched, there certainly is some plausibility associated with some of them. And when you look at what the basis is for his argument, his conclusion, it's essentially that all of the experts in the world on this subject who have looked at it agree that the claim is valid. Guinness World Records says that it's valid. He did work for Guinness World Records. I have to point that out. And then he says case closed. That's the end of the story. Next slide, please. So my real question about this all is, are the research standards reasonable? Young's conclusion in particular, I focus on his paper because I think it's representative and very lucid on this point. His argument is that if you look at the evidence available, the paper trail, the photographic evidence, the signatures, the interviews, and so forth, that it's extremely convincing that the Calment claim is valid. Now, what I would point out is that all of this evidence is in some degree subjective. We, unlike other areas in science, we can't run experiments, we can't replicate Jeanne Calment many times to see how long she lives. She's a one-off, and so what we need to know is it the same person who was born on a certain date that passed away on a certain date? And we don't have any way of confirming that short of perhaps a DNA test, which hasn't been performed. So I just want to emphasize that subjective belief plays a large role in this decision. I also want to, and I've alluded to this, but I just want to point out that a large part of the argument in favor of the Calment claim seems to be an appeal to authority. That is, the people who are experts in this field say that it's a valid claim. The people who say it's not a valid claim really aren't experts in the field, and I am somewhat skeptical when I hear an argument like that being made. By the way, I'm not an expert in this field, and I also want to point out that I'm not really a skeptic about this conclusion. I actually believe that the woman who died in 1997 is Jeanne Calment. I believe that based on photographic evidence, which I'll show you in a few moments. But I'm concerned about the scientific standards and how it is that we deal with subjective information in particular. Next slide, please. So one question is, or a big question is, how do we deal with subjective information? I want to suggest we should ask professional actuaries. Professional actuaries have been working with subjective information for a long time. Often in the field of risk and insurance, we have very limited data. And as we do in this case as well, as you can see from some of the sample lifespans that I showed you, there are very few people who lived over the age of 110. So what do actuaries do? They use Bayesian methods, which are formal statistical procedures for combining subjective belief with objective or scientific observations. And one simple way that they do this is through something called credibility estimation, in which they construct a weighted average of two estimates, 2-point estimates, indicated on the slide as theta with subscript ordinary and then theta subscript subjective. So the first one, the theta ordinary, that's an estimate based on objective data. The other one's based on maybe a variety of weaker sources, including subjective information. And they use methods for choosing the weight Z that is given to the objective or ordinary estimate, and then the complement of that is given to the subjective information. Next slide. I went ahead and calculated a credibility estimator in this case. Specifically, I assumed I was trying to estimate the upper bound on the human lifespan, omega. And I did that two ways. One was just using the observation of Jean Calment's lifespan, and the other was just using the observation of Sarah Knoss. And Sarah Knoss's lifespan stays the same whether or not I think there was fraud, but Jean Calment's changes, and therefore the value of the estimate of omega would change. So what I do is I construct an estimate of omega using just Knoss's age. There is a probability P that goes into that as well, and that's because it's going to change the relative amount of weight that is given to the omega in that calculation. And I do the same thing for the Calment estimate, and then I compute the Z coefficient, the credibility coefficient as well. The P, again, is a parameter. It's the subjective probability of fraud or probability that there was an identity switch. And what we can see when we turn to the next slide is that we can make an estimate of this upper bound omega that is a function of that subjective probability P. So on the left, if we believe that there's no probability of fraud or an identity switch, then we come up with an estimate of about 123.6 years for omega. And if we believe that it was entirely fraudulent, it was certainly fraudulent, with 100% probability on the right-hand side, then that estimate of omega goes down to about 122.6. So that's the effect of either using the Calment claim on its face value or not. And of course, we could choose a P anywhere in between 0 and 1, depending on our personal probability, our personal sense of what this chance of fraud actually is. Next slide. Would this be acceptable? Is this an acceptable way to conduct science? You may be aware, you may have read about Bayesian methods becoming more common in various types of empirical science. But generally that occurs in areas in which sample sizes are reasonably large. In this case, where we have a very small sample size and the subjective parameter P would play an important role, Bayesian methods or this kind of credibility estimate would be looked at somewhat skeptically. And that's because science is usually viewed as a collective undertaking, not a place for personal belief to be injected in and have a tremendous amount of influence. Now, having said that, I would point out that actuaries have been doing this for a long time, and they're not working in isolation, although Michael may have a joke about actuaries and their personalities and so forth. But they do work with other people, and they work on teams, and so it is somewhat collaborative. And I also want to point out that Young and the others in the gerontological establishment, they are working together, certainly, but they are relying heavily on subjective belief. And that is because they don't have a scientific way of validating the person who passed away in 1997, unless they do a DNA test. Okay, so what is it that supports these different approaches? Well, you could say that, actually, I'd like to go back to the previous slide if we could just quickly, sorry. What is it that supports actuarial forecasting? One might argue it's market forces, actuaries that use bad, subjective, judgmental methods will lose money. Their companies will lose money. What about in the case of Young and his colleagues? Well, they have their reputation. There's scholarly peer pressure. Their reputation is on the line. Which of these things is more dependable? The next slide, please. So I actually would argue that neither one is very dependable. I think I think scholarly peer pressure is quite weak. In fact, I've seen from my own experience as an academic and publishing over a number of years, I've seen situations where peer pressure pushed people in what I think is clearly the wrong direction. So I'm not sure that it would validate or should be used to validate a particular point of view. In this case, market forces, I have to say, are also pretty weak. Why? Because an insurance company is not going to go out of business because it calculates omega with 1 year higher or 1 year lower. That's just going to have a very small effect on any kind of real insurance policy or annuity. So I don't think that that's a reasonable constraint here either. But perhaps we could take an idea from this actuarial method and the idea of market forces and strengthen the forces through prediction markets. Now, I don't really need to explain prediction markets to people living in the UK because they're known as betting markets. And you have them, you had them for many years. We don't have them in China. We have them to a limited extent in the United States. What you can do in a prediction market is you could have a statement like the one that's in blue here. Given that French scientists conduct DNA tests on Madame Calment's blood samples, they will confirm there was no identity switch. We could have that statement and people could bet on the validity of that. Now, this is a little different than usual because it's a conditional statement. We don't know whether the DNA test ever will be conducted, but presumably people would still bet on the conditional statement, and their money could be returned if indeed the test isn't carried out in the next 10 years or some period of time. There is some evidence that prediction markets can be very useful in making scientific decisions and predicting scientific outcomes. So I think it actually does lend some credibility to this approach. Finally, if a prediction market existed, next slide, how would you bet? On the right-hand side, we have photographs of Madame Calment, who passed away in 1997. These are all the same woman on the right. I believe she's aging progressively from the upper left to the lower right. And then on the left side, we have a group on the top, a group on the bottom. The top is the mother, Jeanne Calment, taken before 1934, photos taken before then. Bottom, Yvonnie Calment, the daughter, photos taken before 1934. Which one of those do you think, which progression on the left do you think leads to the progression on the right? Perhaps you can tell us in a question and answer. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Michael, thank you so much. And didn't we have a poll question as well about that?
Well, we could do this as a poll question. I didn't set it up formally, but if it's possible, we could do that.
Okay, folks, yeah, here we go.
Great,
You've got your
great.
poll question. So do you think it's Jean Calment? Do you believe the story, Yvonne Calment, or would you bet that it's just Madame Calment?
I think that they would need to be clear. They would need to bet on Jean or Yvonne, and they should not bet on Madame.
Yeah, sorry. So,
Madame
sorry.
will interpret Madame as undecided.
Yeah, undecided, yes. Sorry. So the poll is there. We're getting close to the end. Virtually the entire audience has voted. So we'll just close that poll
Great.
and show you the results. And you've got a group. Half of us believe it's Jean, and a quarter are undecided, and a quarter believe it's Yvonne. So that's super.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, so,
if you could could you put that last slide up again? Actually,
sure.
I just wanted to inject I've looked at these photos a lot, and I don't necessarily recommend that you do that yourself. But if you're interested, there's quite a bit of information on the internet available. I'm convinced by the photographic evidence, even though it apparently hasn't been examined by professional, forensic experts. But I'm convinced that if you look, for example, at the photo in the upper left, and the older woman on the upper left, where she's looking down, that looks very much like the one of Jean Calment in the lower right. And then actually, if you move to the right on the older woman, that looks, and then you move to the left in Jean Calment, those two kind of match. And then you go again to the right on Madame Calment, to the left on Jean Calment. They kind of match. I don't see the same resemblance with the daughter.
Okay.
But there have been people who have looked at photographs of the earlobes, of the shape of the nose, and they're convinced that actually it is Yvonne. So it's a very interesting question.
Well, Michael, we got a lot of questions and not a lot of time, so I'm just gonna. I just think this whole idea that actuaries are kind of playing Hercule Poirot is kind of interesting. I'm also, of course, a little interested as well, because, of course, you allude to Madame Calment's family's interests, which, of course, is intriguing.
Right.
They are, in fact, in many ways actuarial. It was France is the home of the tontine. In other words, the last person standing gets all the cash. And France is also the home of contingency contracts on property. And I believe this was the case, that she signed a contract with her lawyer when she was something like 75, and then she outlived both her lawyer and the subsequent owner, and basically lived in her house for free, if I recall correctly.
That's right. But that wasn't the motivation for the supposed fraud. That actually happened much later. The fraud, if it did take place, is something that happened in the 1930s. Oh. And I believe it was some kind of annuity or account, but I don't remember the details.
Well, we can get that online, but just a couple of things. So we've got a few people who want to understand a few things. Sure. So the first is what Bob Compton is curious. What does this imply for the idea of black swan events? So we've got another question here from Christopher Gleedle. Would the double slit experiment be an extraordinary event? And I might throw in, is climate change an extraordinary event? Certainly when I was a young person, that was a 1 in a million would easily be. The planet's going to, overheat in 100 years, we're all going to die. So just a quick elaboration on that.
Okay, these are all things that I think about. But I don't know if that have a good answer. I think that actually it is not a bad idea with so-called black swan events. I tend to think of them as, in terms of probability distributions, as probability distributions that have heavy tails, unlike the human lifespan distribution, which is very light. So if you were to want to make a forecast of just how big something could be out in the tail, and you don't really know the true distribution, I think that bringing together people through prediction markets could be a very good way of aggregating subjective information that goes into that that estimate. With regard to the double slit experiment, certainly before the various phenomena of quantum physics were known, the various counterintuitive aspects were known. That would, yes, have been an extraordinary claim to say that. Now it's become quite understood as routine, although it still remains counterintuitive. I find it extraordinary in that I find it very hard to get my head around it. I guess many physicists do as well. So I would say it's extraordinary in that sense, but it not in a scientific sense, because it certainly does fit predictive models. And then your third one was about climate change. I think that's another good situation where we could aggregate beliefs from through prediction markets, because there's a lot of subjective information and a really broad base of information.
Okay. Bob Compton, and I think Bob's referring to your slide on the subjective credibility estimate on your Bayesian approach. If the 122 age were false, then the next oldest age was 119, but you put up 122.5.
That's correct.
Could you just explain that quickly?
Oh, okay, so first of all, in that slide, the numbers that are on there are the estimates of omega, and omega is always going to be above an actual lifespan. What happens is if there's fraud, that person, that number, her age suddenly drops to 99, which is the age at which Yvonnie would have passed away.
But your estimate of omega is
right.
And another quick one. Wouldn't it be more important than perhaps a DNA test would be, because we got a number of people lurking just below, isn't the test to wait a few years until they exceed 122 or not?
Yes, that's certainly what, there have been a number of papers written about that. Actually, there are some papers written on the subject of how long are we going to have to wait until someone beats Jean Calment's record. I don't want to jinx any of those people who are on the list, but the probability that somebody who is 118 or 119 making it to 122 is very, very remote.
Right.
And so the probability is still very small that will happen.
Yeah. Madhu Acharya is curious. So we got all these innovative technologies, machine learning to deal with subjective data of insurance underwriting and claims processing. Can these innovative technologies actually replace the traditional methods that actuaries are historically using?
I think that when there are large sets of data, yes. I mean, roughly speaking, yes. When the large sets of data, as long as they're interpreted properly and as long as there's not a misunderstanding of what the data actually are, yes. When there are small samples, we're always going to be left with a subjective element. It's possible that AI and machine learning techniques can develop ways of formalizing that through certain algorithms, and they might do better than human beings. That's certainly possible, but I think that they will be doing the same thing that human beings are doing now with subjective information.
I was very interested, sort of, this is between you and me, very interested in the fact that you ended on a kind of a fairly strong affirmation of prediction markets. Zien built a prediction market back in '99, which is still running today, so getting on for 22 years, called Ecstasy, which I put in the chat room, and we bet on the news coverage of various countries is one of the markets. There are several other markets, but that's the biggest one. But I've always had this difficulty. I guess one of the granddaddies is the Iowa exchange, which is looking at presidential elections. But these are people who are professionals, and they've got their professional reputation, and they can bet a little bit on it as long as it's not there because it's based in the States. Abroad, as you point out, betting markets are there. And I find that great, but it's the fact that people put money on it, and people won't put large amounts of money, relatively speaking, on things that they don't have an opinion on, and their opinion is arguably formed by that. We then, of course, get into differentials between inordinately wealthy people who might put on bets which seem very large to you and me, but are actually inconsequential to them. So it's getting the right prediction market is quite a problem. So, asking everybody on the planet about climate change is probably asking everybody on the planet what they think about media coverage. It doesn't really garner new information. You said that in the case of actuarial forecasting, one of the approaches was that reasonableness presumably is ensured by market forces. And yet, when we had the financial crisis, we found that the market forces around actuaries, particularly on things like pensions, as well as some of the actuaries who were involved in CDOs and things, weren't really valid. Any comments on that before we close?
I don't know that I would blame actuaries specifically. I think that there was much blame to go around in the financial crisis, and I think many insurance actuaries were actually doing their jobs very well. So I'm not sure I want to lay that at their door. Yeah. With regard to climate change, I think you make a really good point, and that could even be politicized. For example, some people could bet money to achieve a certain outcome. I would never suggest doing a prediction market on something really like a real, big question, like, is climate change caused by human beings? Okay, I would do it on some very narrow thing, like, what is the chance that we will see more hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin next year than this year, or something like that.
Gotcha.
I think there is evidence. I'm not an expert in the area of prediction markets, but I've read about them somewhat. I think there is evidence that what happens is that people who go into these markets and they find they don't know what's going on, they don't bet, or they start educating themselves, or they ask other people who do know. So I think it's just still a good way of gathering information, or crowdsourcing information, so to speak. I don't think it's a solution to every problem. No, I know there are true believers out there like that. I'm looking at it as a pragmatic approach to some.
No, and I would agree with you. We're fans of it, or we wouldn't be running one. So yeah, we like it. I just really adore the idea of delving into this arcane case of Jean Calment and really pulling it apart and showing how actuaries think. I think you've done a wonderful job today of explaining to the audience how you would approach it and how actually it can add value to the analysis. So for that, I absolutely must thank you. But I must thank three quickly, if I may. Firstly, our sponsors, thank you for, as ever, being tolerant and let us range across things. And I hope you've got an idea of how actuarial science fits into our technology, economics, and finance world. Secondly, to the audience, always great of you there. I just got a quick note from somebody that ecstasy is down, but we will just quickly restart that. So that was put in the room there. We do have a number of things coming ahead later this week and next. As ever, let me save you time. Go check it out on the website, register, and do send on to your friends, family, and colleagues. But most importantly, Michael, we've known each other for a while. I've always adored the way that you write, not least quoting you to the government earlier this month. I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your insights into actuarial science. And it's certainly not an extraordinary claim to claim that you are actually one of the leaders in the field. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd be very happy if anyone in the audience would like to write to me. My email address is on the slides. I look forward to hearing from you.
Great.
Thank you.
再见。
再见。